And hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Church and Symbol Indian Country podcast. I'm here, as always, with the venerable, but not at all ready to be proclaimed a bishop yet, Father Mike Carson. And today we have a special guest. And I can't actually see our special guest on my screen, but I know he's here. I saw him a second ago. Would you like to introduce yourself, Father?
Sure. My name is Father James Nodebart. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis. I've been a priest for 53 years, 12 of which I worked at the Chancery in the Department of Worship during a time when all the documents were coming out in the 70s and early 80s. I spent 4 years in Africa and Zambia teaching in a national seminary. By accident, I was in charge of the Pope's Mass, Pope John Paul II's, when he came. It only took a year's planning. And when I came back to the United States, I asked Archbishop Roach if I could work with the American Indian people in the Twin Cities. And so for 35 years, I worked with both the Ojibwe and the Dakota people. The Dakota people have invited me, they're from Prairie Island Indian Reservation, to participate in a lot of their ceremonies. So I've done Hamblecha, which is Vision Quest, for close to 30 years now. And they also invited me to be involved in the Sundance. And so one of the ironies, and I'll talk about this in the presentation, is at Prairie Island, we line up for Sundance based on age, so youngest to the oldest. And I'm 79, so I'm at the end of the pile, if you will. But it's always the oldest and the youngest that begin the ceremonies. And so here I am that begins the ceremony. And the Indian people know it's a Catholic priest. They still call me always Father Jim. And it's no threat to them that I'm somehow stealing their ceremonies. I'm invited to participate in them. So that's kind of the context in which I'm going to share some of my responses to your questions.
What you just said about them not being worried about you taking and stealing their ceremonies, the thing you just said, though, is they invited you to be a part of it with them. It's a completely different thing than you co-opting it, taking it somewhere else, and then doing it yourself and saying, oh, well, I have the right to do this now. It's not the way at all.
I am the guest. I am their guest. Yes.
Exactly. And so that's a great point about respect for Native ceremony and Native culture. Is if they invite you to be with them, then they're inviting you to be with them. It doesn't then become yours and you have the right to appropriate it, which is a problem, as we know, cultural appropriation. So, but not to linger on that. So one of the concerns from a Catholic audience, I suppose one of the concerns from a Native audience is what we just said, cultural appropriation. But one of the concerns from a Catholic audience, especially some of our more supposedly, quote unquote, quotation fingers, traditional Catholics, especially those that are big into like the TLM and all that, they're so super afraid of synchronism. Anything that looks like a merging of one thing with our thing, it seems like, well, they worry about it. They worry about losing our Catholic identity and what the liturgy should look like. It's not my concern, but those concerns do exist. What about synchronism? What about supposedly the Catholic identity and the liturgy? How do you respond to those issues?
Well, I will tag on to your word about fear. I see it as fear that if things are brought in that aren't part of the Roman tradition, we lose some of our identity.
Yeah.
And yet at the base, the Roman Catholic liturgy has always been expansive and adaptive. We've had the Syro-Malabarese rite, Lebanese rite, and in the ancient times we had Mozarabic, Gallican, Milanese. We still have the Orthodox traditions within our fold. So what's happened over history is things have come in and they become so much part of us that we don't even realize that they didn't belong to us at the beginning. For example, the Advent wreath, the Christmas tree, incense, bells, vestments, all of them came in over the centuries, and they never created a threat.
Mhm.
I like that. I like that sense. What we were given, and this is part of the theology of it. When Justin wrote his first apology, he described what was going on at Sunday Eucharist, and that becomes the bones around which the flesh of our liturgy has always been built. Uh, but it doesn't have anything about a sense of the color of things, what's being said, where it's being said, and all those things. It's simply a grid, if you will. And then over history, as the church marched into various cultures, it began like the elasticity of absorbing those things. And the deal is this: I think the church was not afraid that somehow it would be destroyed by absorbing. It simply allowed the cultural reality to be an expression of itself. The early churches didn't fear synchronicity. One of the perfect examples is the Church of St. Clement in Rome. At the basement of the church in the archaeology is a street. On one side of the street is the cult of Mithra. On the other side of the street is the Roman church. They both used bread, they both used wine. They weren't afraid of each other. They lived across the street. So I kind of answer to the synchronistic thing is if we know who we are, there is no fear.
And furthermore, as Nicholas Blackout said, both sides really make each other better.
Yeah.
So thank you for that explanation. I appreciate that. Kind of along those lines, I'm reading from a list of Father Carson's questions, but in the same line, so I want to look at this from two perspectives. Okay, so on the one hand, and we've kind of addressed this already, but let's just go a little bit further. How do you adapt the Roman liturgy to include native cultural elements without distracting from the sacredness of the Roman liturgy? You already kind of addressed that a little bit, but maybe if you'd like to say a little bit more along those lines.
Yeah, I would. For one thing, I think the word sacred is multivalent. It has many, many different applications, and there are many elements that are associated with it: texts, actions, space, visual environment, the ethos, the ethos of the rites itself. If we ground our sense of the sacred in belief, we believe that what we do is sacred, then all the elements that are part of our action become sacred. No individual thing. I'm thinking, recently we had the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, and it was a simple thing. Jesus took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he distributed it. It was in green grass, no songs, no texts, no churches, but yet it in itself was a sacred event for the people. So here would be an example of something Jesus himself did, tremendously sacred, but outside of our categories of sacred. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is what we believe that we're doing is sacred.
I'd like to take that and look at it and turn it the other way around.
Okay.
With regard to the involvement or the incorporation of native cultural elements, for example, I mentioned doing a mass there in Pine Ridge, and one of the things I really it was so beautiful and so profound, it almost distracted me. But during the liturgy of the Eucharist, I had already been told that this was their custom, but I still, until you experience it, you just can't be prepared for it. I did the elevation, mm-hmm. And at the elevation, an elder man was there with his drum, and 1, 2,
3, 4,
and knowing the culture, knowing the people, and knowing the tradition, and knowing the representation, that's the heartbeat that represents.
Yep.
That was so powerful, so profound.
Hmm. Hmm.
And like I said, it was almost distracting. And I
Yep.
just about got emotional. I was just fighting back tears, going, "Oh my God, that was so beautiful."
Yep.
Other reservations where I do mass sometimes when I'm visiting, they'll have, as we all know, most natives use cedar as a
Yes.
purification, as an
Yep.
incense. So we'll cedar the altar, and of course, on some tribes, they'll have it right there next to you, up at the presider's chair, an eagle wing, right? So
Yes.
these are things that typically, non-natives or people outside of native ceremonies wouldn't be permitted to use, but it's allowed, in those communities, and rightly so, I believe. So my point is to take that question the other way around. How do we incorporate native cultural elements while respecting native sacredness, the sacredness of native ceremonial and cultural elements?
In a sense, it's an easy answer because you answered it yourself. It's the elder who drummed. And so, what the native peoples will do is bring you what's central to their prayer, and they will offer them to us to use. And sometimes they're parallels. Cedar and sage and sweetgrass and so forth really parallel incense. There's no history of what incense is made from. That often came from Ethiopia, but they offer them to us, and they make it available to us. Part of that kind of balance and go between, the native people say this is important to us, and it's not that um, we're transforming the rite in a sense. We have the bones. This is the flesh around the bones, like the drumming, and the man who gave the drumming to the ceremony.
I want to put in a promotion. Not that we need to, but I want to put in a
Yeah,
promotion for cedar. You
yeah,
said that it's a common element. It's a fact that I was in sacristy looking at the incense that we had, and I was looking at the ingredients, the label.
yes, yeah,
One of the ingredients was cedar.
yeah,
But
sure.
furthermore, I mean, you look at the Old Testament, look at King David. I mean, cedar was an important part of our cultural tradition all along anyway. So
That's
it's
right.
not like it conflicts with anything that we've already been doing. And besides which, like I said, the insensation that we have, I mean, it's really no different. So one thing I'd like to kind of, if I can find this really quick, I'd like to ask your opinion, or ask you to maybe elaborate on a point. Let me
Yeah.
read this to you. So, as you know, the volume 2 of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigation was released a couple of
Mm-hmm.
days ago, and
Yes.
in chapter 10 of that report, it addresses the role of religious institutions and organizations in the boarding school system. I'd like to read this quote to you and ask you, as it does apply to our um, attitudes about the sacredness of Native people. We as a church didn't always feel that way. And this
Yep.
quote really personifies that. Let me read this to you. This is from that report. This says, "It is surprising to how many very common customs these old beliefs apply and how firmly they are held by them." Okay, so we're talking about Native children taking into the boarding schools and being enculturated into Christianity, and they're talking about the old beliefs, the supposedly pagan beliefs that they had. So the comment continues to say, "Their pagan beliefs therefore constitute the chief basis of life, so that little change is possible except through a change in religion. Pagan Indians have a peculiar religious philosophy which so powerfully shapes their lives in the wrong direction that only the true inculcations of the true religion can set them right. The hope of the Indians' regeneration, therefore, lies not in education alone, nor in civilization alone, but in Christianity united with these great forces." And that was a quote from Daniel Dorchester, the former superintendent of Indian schools for the BIA. Would you
Yeah,
like to address that, Father?
I would. Uh, it goes back to the church, a century ago saying, without the church, there is no salvation, which clipped off, of course, the Episcopal, the Methodist, the Lutheran, and everybody else. It's an elitism, I think, in which Schoolhouse, among others, talked about the Western superiority. And I think, through starting with Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi, a fundamental respect for other cultures. When I got to Zambia, when I got to Africa, I got stuck in Kenya for a couple months, and I started reading anthropology, and they had a good library. And I realized as I was reading it that it was all white European anthropologists. So it came with a bias toward Greco-Roman understanding of society. The indigenous understanding is much more flexible and incorporative. It brings things in, and it's less systematic, but it's much broader in its perspective. And what the church has done in the last 50 or maybe even longer, maybe through the Jesuits, even the 16th century, has recognized the authentic grounding of other cultures. And it's been slow. I mean, if you look at the United States, we had a prejudice way up to the 60s of the Black culture, African American culture. And so it's a prejudicial perspective. In terms of the boarding schools themselves, they were cultural change agents. There's no doubt about it. I'm a product of a boarding school. I went to a boarding school at 14, and I was there for 12 years, actually, because it was a minor seminary. And it imprinted on me. The values that they gave imprinted on me, some of which I've discarded over the years. And the thing I think that the church can offer is the ability to think. And then we make our own decisions about things. So Schoolcraft and others like the one you quoted is one perspective. We can think differently, and we do.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your explanation there. So obviously the whole point of having this conversation about native acculturation is because we as a church have recognized some of our errors, one of which was completely discounting native spirituality as being anything holy or good or pure. St. John Paul the Great, he said in that, that we as Catholics should not fear that which is good and holy in non-Christian religions, rather asserting the supremacy that Christ is the fullness of truth, which doesn't discount that there was already truth there in their traditional beliefs anyway. Father Carson is always making the claim, the quote rather, which I really appreciate of him. He says the Holy Spirit was in the Western Hemisphere long before Europeans got here. The sacredness of native ceremonies, the sacredness of native culture. If anything about that quote, as offensive as it is, it does identify just how intrinsically woven into the fabric of natives' lives their traditional ceremonial beliefs are, which is a good thing. And so as a church, it's good that we recognize that which is good and holy in non-Christian religions, especially as those non-Christian religions here in the Western Hemisphere made them better able to accept a suffering Christ who would offer up his flesh for the good of his people, just as the sun dancer does every summer in the Plains cultures. They're better able to understand Christ, the suffering Christ. But just to go back to the point of enculturation, or enculturation rather. So what are the consequences of not enculturating the Roman liturgy with native elements and native communities? And then with that, what are the roadblocks to doing it correctly or to doing it well?
I think that one of the consequences is that um, well, put it this way. For me, it begins with missiology. If we have read like Agentes and the documentation on missiology, we begin to understand how we approach other cultures, and then you can overlay that with the sense of liturgy. And what I find is that the blocks to that are usually sometimes people who don't even understand the Roman tradition. I mentioned to Father Carson about the Muscalera Apaches. Recently, there's a situation in which a new priest came into the Muscalera Apache church there, and the first thing he did was removed an icon of Christ as an Apache. Well, it was painted by a Catholic priest in 1989. And if that priest had understood, not that priest, but if the new priest had understood our own legislation, he would have been more sensitive to simply bulldozing something out of the church without talking. So part of it is understanding missiology and how to approach people. And then, Pope John Paul II and Francis talks about humility and openness. John Paul or Francis talked about sitting around the table to talk. And that's kind of the beginning. The results of just superimposing a Roman structure with no sense of the culture is something that'll be rejected, because people will say, well, then they're not even interested in us. They're just imposing on us something that comes from elsewhere. The priest obviously didn't ask the people what they felt about that icon. Maybe even if they didn't like the fact that he was Apache, they liked the priest that painted it. It's multivalent. And you could find those things out by sense of humility, sitting around the table and talking. Your example of the Sundance is a perfect one. And the way, at least among the Dakota people at Prairie Island, the tree is a forked tree with a crossbar to it of let's see, forget the not willow, but it becomes a cross. And their understanding of sacrifice, the blood sacrifice from piercing, is really easy them to understand that someone would die on the cross. No problem.
Again, one of the sad things about the first contact with natives and Catholics is that often there wasn't a willingness to sit down and listen and learn their cultural because they're very compatible. The Sundance is a great example. I have said that Jesus was an S-O-N dancer.
Yep.
He was a Sundancer, the S-O-N dancer. So to continue with that question, though, so what are some of the problems with doing it well? What are some of the problems with doing it? For example, we all know, Father Carson and I say this all the time, that native cultures from one culture to the next, even in the same state, are as vastly different as different European countries are. So to do it well, obviously you have to know the people, you have to know their culture, you have to have them come in and be a part of that, and to listen to the elders and to listen to what they say. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes. People are going to be offended. You'll paint the medicine wheel and the Lakota tribe the way that the Anishinaabe people do it, and
with the directions, the different directions,
the different directional colors, and people will be like, "This is wrong." So, along with that, though, what are some of the problems to doing native enculturation into the liturgy well? What are some of the roadblocks to that?
It goes back to the people. Our Cathedral of St. Paul, was built in 1917, and the back chapel has all the peoples that were part of the diocese: Czech, French, German, Irish, and all of them have saints. We had national parishes at that time. and the priests at that time understood the cultures that they were in, very different from one another. The same way with indigenous people. When I go up up north in Minnesota, they're largely Ojibwe, and when I pray, and this might be at wakes and funerals and so forth, I'll use Ojibwe, and then the mythology, if you will, of directional death is the Ojibwe understand going west. And so we talk about going west and the fact that Christian bodies are often placed in the grave so that they're looking east toward the resurrection. It's metaphoric. So you're simply aware that those cultures understand those metaphors in that way. So back to the 200 and some tribes and languages, they're little communities and you're part of them. The most difficult thing is in the urban areas where you have multiple tribes represented in a single parish. And their Indianness is what joins them together culturally, but their religious expression is very different. So for example, we have a series of rattles in our parish that were given to us by Indian people. We let the elders decide how and when they would be used. And in the Ojibwe tradition, it's largely women, elder women, who will make the call on that. We have had those rattles for 30 years. They've yet to be used. and so there's this sense that we respect that process, that they feel until the day comes when they said, no, Father, I think we ought to use them. They're not used. What I'm saying is pay attention to your individual environment, your culture that's part of your parish.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess let me ask one last question before I turn it over to Father Carson and let him weigh in on this discussion. What are some of your reasons that you believe that we should make the effort to incorporate Native elements into the sacred liturgy?
Good question. In a sense, an easy answer if you talk about the papal statements. Both Paul VI and Francis and John Paul II say it enriches us. So we become better and richer because of it. One example is nature. Roman liturgy is grounded in nature. Feast of the birth of John the Baptist recently, the feasts of Assumption, Advent, Christmas, and so forth are all connected to nature. What the indigenous world does is it plunges us even more deeply into nature. We have the whole tradition of ours of rising early at dawn, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock lauds, midday prayer, mid-afternoon prayer. We rang the bells about that, and they've ceased now in a lot of places. And in fact, in France, they even tried to ban bell ringing because they didn't want it to intrude Christianity in the neighborhood, right? But the indigenous world plunges us into nature. I was asked by Jake Emperor, Jesuit who's recently died. He asked me, what's the difference in spiritualities? And I tried to explain it theologically with him. And I was taking him to the St. Paul Seminary for a talk. And I said, don't step on the beetle on the sidewalk. And he said, I didn't see it. And I said, that's the difference. That's the difference. So it makes us better is the base answer.
Father Carson, would you like to join us in the conversation, please?
Yes, I would love to join you. First of all, let's go for confession. At the Tequila conference in Raleigh, I took a lot of what you said, Father James, and for my presentation of what you said and also what you've written too. So I just kind of plagiarized all your stuff. I think
it's welcome to do it. It's free offer.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. I'm glad you're not going to give me a severe penance for doing that. But during the presentation, we talked a lot about this, and it's a very important idea that every single liturgy we do is culturally based. There's not one liturgy that says this is the perfect liturgy and it's outside culture. Everything, every liturgy, every mass we do has cultural elements. It's culturally based.
Yes,
So if you
yes,
have a European priest who's used to European mass and celebrating a European style mass, going into a native area or a native assembly and still saying this is where I'm going to celebrate mass, there's a disconnect to the people he's serving. I talk about trying to be a servant leader, that you're a servant to the people and not there
yes.
to do your own stuff. But could you talk about that, the idea of that mismatch of the people in the pews and the priest or liturgy is celebrating the liturgy in his own culture, to talk about how we can make sure that we do not have that misplaced, this mismatch of what we're doing?
Yeah, the answer is both easy and hard. I think it relates to how holy the priest is. If the people sense that the priest is humble, trying to pray, trying to respect their culture, even if he presides at an absolutely straight, non-included Roman liturgy, they will still love him. If he begins to incorporate things from their culture, they will love him even more. So ironically, and I mean, we've always said this, a lot of it comes back to the priests themselves and their engagement with the people. But that's true in local parishes. We had a recent parish near us that the priest was there too long, and he became quite brittle. And new priest came in, and they had a festival last weekend, and the priest helped shuck the corn for the festival because we had sweet corn as part of the meal. That won him a lot of points. It's only shucking corn, you know, but it said he was part of the people. So that's kind of my answer there. And the other piece, I think, and this is true more and more, it's a commitment to the culture itself and the people. I asked Archbishop Roach to come to Indian ministry and ultimately Gitchie Material Parish. And at that same conversation, I said, Archbishop, and I liked him a lot. I said, I will make a long-term commitment to this ministry. So I decided that Archbishop should know I make a long-term commitment. Now, nowadays, 5-6 years is about it. And I don't know how long it takes for people to trust. I mean, now, I was just yesterday at the wake of a young man whom I had baptized who died. And I had buried his grandmother and his grandfather years ago. So there's this lineage, and people know that. They remember that I did those things. So answer is that sense of humility and holiness, but also commitment there.
Goes back to my days of working in the Navajo Nation, because occasionally we had college students and even some high school students come through. I'd always give them Navajo 101. And one of the things I really stressed on is building trust. And building trust takes a long time. It's just not a one-time deal, because the Navajo especially have had their trust violated so many times.
Yes.
And the way you do trust is just not talk about it. You do what you say you're going to do. It becomes very important. The other point, it came across my desk last year. There is I won't name the radio station, or the TV station who did this is supposedly a Catholic station, but the subject of smudging came up, and the person on the radio or on the television talked about how it was satanic and stuff like that. Goes back to the idea that they're so tight holding on to that European model, they're just not open to any other expressions of liturgy. And I think that's actually at the core of racism too, which is a problem. And as you said, it goes back to the priest. The priest has got to be open to be a servant leader. and that this is not, the priest has to tell himself, this is not how I'm going to celebrate liturgy, or I want to celebrate liturgy, but I'm going to listen to the people, which goes to my second question. And we've talked about this during this last 45 minutes to an hour. And that's the importance of dialogue, of conversations, especially with the elders. With the Navajo Nation, it was the women who were the people to talk to, the women elders, which is more important in terms of liturgy and the church. And I know I had a story a couple years ago of a priest who went to a native parish, and I thought he would be a very good idea if he can to talk to in the native language and use a spiritual language, which is a different type of language. When he tried that, he was rushed out of the parish because people found that extremely offensive. So that's kind of a lack of dialogue. But can you talk about, as in our closing time here, talk about the importance of dialogue, especially with the elders of the community?
In coming again, I started with the Ojibwe in my Indian ministry, 1989. And I had mentioned earlier that I read all these anthropology books before I started teaching in Africa. When I came back, I realized that that was totally wrong. And I made a decision to allow people to teach me what they thought I should learn. And within, I would say 5 months, someone came down from Canada and said, "Do you have an Indian name?" And I said, "No, I don't." "Okay, come May, we want you to come up to Manitoba and meet with one of the elders up there, Peter O'Cheese, and offer tobacco and ask for a name." So I went to the ceremonies, to Peter's ceremonies, for 6 or 8 years, to the point where he would ask me to do certain things. It was a longhouse ceremony, and I would make sometimes the breastplates and so forth. And it came to a point where some young guys would come and they said, "Well, we want to make breastplates." And Peter would say, "Go ask him." And then they'd say, "Oh, he's white." And Peter Chiefs would say, "So what? So what?" And what I sense back to elders, in the Ojibwe tradition, it's elder women. And with us, it was Alberta St. Clair. She's the one that taught me Ojibwe. And occasionally you say, "Father, don't say that, because you can mispronounce some Ojibwe that is threatening or at least horrible." I let her process things, issues within the parish. We had a parish council, we had a finance council, we had all of that stuff, but there was also this group of women that would process for us our direction. And you have to be humble enough. Back to the rattles. So I wait 35 years and we still don't use them, and it's my Teutonic background that would say, after 10 years, give up. Or my Teutonic background that say, after 3 months, give up. But I have to set that aside. The other piece is you begin when things are ready. And I learned that my mother would say, if you're not there early, you're late. So I was on time for everything, in quotes. But on time in the Ojibwe tradition is when things are ready. I asked when the Sundance ends, and one of the elders said, "The Sundance ends when the food is prepared." So it's that sense of presence to the people and really absorbing their truth, I guess.
Thank you, Father James.
You're welcome.
And also, we just seem to scratch the surface of this very important topic.
Very much.
I know you're working with your principal writers to document the Subcommittee of Native American Affairs. Our bishops are writing on this very subject for the entire church, of the enculturation of Native communities with the liturgy. Perhaps we can come back on to our podcast and to talk about the document itself.
The bishops have done a marvelous thing in their document here. This document, Keeping Christ's Sacred Promise, is the most fundamental thing that's happened in the church for 40 years, maybe 50 years. So I appreciate the work of the committee and Bishop Zielinski and yours as part of that effort. It's all but two bishops voted for it. So, and we don't know who the two bishops were that didn't, but
yeah, there's actually the idea that because I've seen it, the pad where they vote on is so small that a lot of bishops just have large thumbs and they get to the wrong number and they can't take it back. So don't take the two bishops and blame them and get upset about these two
I
bishops.
said,
However, thanks again for the plug. I noticed as from the very beginning of Father David talked about the second edition of the Department of Interior report. It actually quotes the framework. And it's gone with the AP Wire and others. In fact, the Washington Post published on their online edition the entire document, which is kind of unheard of for the Washington Post. So again, thank you for the plug for the framework. And now the real work comes in trying to implement the framework. So talk about that's their next 30-year endeavor. And get back to Father David. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Father James, really quick, if you could, because we're really just about out of time. Father Carson hit on something that I wanted to have somebody address for the general public for a very long time.
Okay.
And as usual, Father Carson comes up with some really good points that have me thinking afterwards going, man, that was a really good point. I'm glad he said that. So the idea, the ridiculous notion, but you hear people say it all the time, this whole fear that Catholics have against smudging, and for some reason, specifically sage, which is absolutely ridiculous because it's part of our culture anyway as Catholics, the incensation and all of these other things.
Yep. That's right.
And the fact that God created these elements, right? But I remember very vividly reading an article where a priest in, I don't know where he was, Minnesota, South Dakota, Montana, I don't know. But he was going, he had been asked by some of his parishioners who were native if he would bless their sweat lodge rocks, the rocks. Thanks. And he said, yeah, I'll be happy to. So he said, yeah, I'll be happy to. And so he did, right? So the Inipi rocks are usually like lava rocks, very porous, right? Yep. So he goes out and he does the blessing for them. People were up in arms over this. So many people were talking about how it was pagan and all this crap. I have had on 2 occasions I think the term we like to use these days is deliverance ministry. A priest in deliverance ministry, an exorcist. On 2 occasions, I have heard this exorcist say in a presentation that he was giving that some of the many doorways that you can have, cause spiritual problems because you open up these doorways to the demonic. And he was talking about different doorways, right? And one of the things he said was, smudging with sage could be a doorway to allowing the demonic. And I really wish that I had my hand up to refute that and to ask his question and why he said that. Insofar as you could make the argument that people that culturally appropriate native cultures and they integrate it into this new agey stuff, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they're praying in a way that invites in spirits and all of that, you could make the argument that, that's spiritually very dangerous. But if we're talking about native culture as practiced by natives, the way they do it, very sacred, it's very holy. Not only is it not something to be afraid of, but it's something which is a very powerful blessing. But yet so many people in our church are afraid of it, that it's all satanic and that, we're going to allow ourselves to be, all these. Would you please address that? I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Part of it is the answer that sage and smudging are part of an integral rite of the indigenous culture, as is cedar and so forth. The problem with New Age over here is they're eclectic. So they may take crystals and bells and Syrian incense and Ethiopian incense and Korean incense and sage, and they concoct something that it is not pure in the sense of having any lineage whatsoever. Is that the doorway? and then is Syrian, Ethiopian, Korean incense, and sage all doorways to Satanism? I have no clue. I don't know that these people are even thinking about Satanism, but all the things that God gave, creation, namely, is a gift that's, and how it's used as part of that cultural world and expression, whether it's Ethiopian incense, Syrian incense,
Right.
Korean incense.
So natives themselves will tell you that their ceremonies are very powerful, and therefore they're not to be messed with. It's only those people who have been trained and given the authority, have been given the right to do it, who are able to do it. Otherwise, you can cause all kinds of harm.
Yep.
And so when you take the new agey stuff and they start incorporating these different elements and they don't know what they're doing, it can be very dangerous. But in and of itself, native culture and the native ceremonies and native cultural practices, including burning sage and all these other things, as done by actual native people, it is not, and I firmly believe this, it is not a doorway into anything demonic, just the opposite. It is a blessing and something that Catholics should stop being so afraid of.
Yep. Yep.
Which I suppose has a lot to do with our ability to accept native culturalization into the liturgy. Don't be afraid of it.
That's right.
Well, Father James, thank you so much for all of your insights and all of the your great knowledge and expertise that you shared with us today. I agree with Father Carson. We definitely need to have you on again. You've been such a great, I really, truly, genuinely appreciate not only your ministry and your commitment to Native people, but also you being with us today. And so as we conclude this episode of the Church and Symbol Indian Country podcast, Father James, would you like to lead us in a closing prayer, please?
God, our Father, I give you thanks for all the blessings you have given to us. I give you thanks above all for life that you've extended to our earth and to us personally. I give you thanks for your Son, Jesus, the Son Jesus, who came a king, who came to the whole earth to make us Abanugia, to make us relatives. God, our Father, watch over us, protect us, guide us in your love. Shaweni Mishanam Shemanidu. Shaweni Mishanam Shemanidu. Shaweni Mishanam Shemanidu. Shaweni Mishanam Shemanidu. Have pity on us, God. Amen.
Aho magwich palamaya niaesh and duramila mila mahagat and Gaelic.
Yep.
A little bit of everything in there. Thank you so much, Father James, and certainly would love to have you on again.
You're welcome. Be happy to come back again.
Definitely. Thank you, sir.